So I think that one thing that the internet has really changed is the kind of information that you have access to, the age at which you have access to it, and how you interact with that information. And I think we're still learning all of the ins and outs of how that affects people. But I think that particularly if you think about the world in which young people today are growing up, and therefore the way that they're becoming introduced to politics and their role in politics and the opportunities available to them in politics, that's really different even from when I was growing up, when I had the internet for a lot of my sort of high school years, but then social media in college. I think that that's really starting to change. And I think it has the potential to do both really good and really challenging things. It has the potential for you to encounter ideas that in previous iterations of technology it would have been much harder to encounter. You have the opportunity to see ideas from all over the world and to have your political identity formed in the context of that sort of global information space. And I think that that can be really exciting. I think it also, we have a lot of evidence that we tend to opt into information environments that support the views that we already hold. And some of what I think is emerging now is that can help create opportunities for more extreme ideologies to have footholds in places where they might not have, and for people to become sort of ensconced in these bubbles where they feel like they're getting lots of information because there's a lot of sort of the amount of information is quite large, but that in reality they're not getting the kind of interaction that might exist if they had to do it more face to face. I think that social media has the potential to be an effective tool for political mobilization. I think that if you think about what a tool is, right? If you have a hammer, you can build an amazing building with a hammer, but you can also break your thumb if you're not using the tool very well, right? And I think that social media creates spaces for viewpoints and for the opportunity to express and spread information by people who didn't have that opportunity before. I think that it helps to break down some of the hierarchies that existed before. And that can mean that things like political oppositions have more space to get their viewpoints out. On the other hand, governments also have access to these tools. States also have access to these tools. The mainstream media has access to these tools, and extremist groups have access to these tools. So when we think about the opportunity for maybe previously marginal groups to have their views expressed, that might be oppositions in authoritarian regimes, but it can also be terrorist organizations or extremist nationalist organizations. So I think it has the potential to be a really powerful tool. And I think we've seen some of that positively in places like Turkey, also in Ukraine, in the United States, in lots of places around the world. But it's like any tool, it isn't inherently good or bad. It's about the way that it gets used. I think that oppositions are always creative and in trying to come up with ways to have leverage and to find opportunities to leverage the limited power that they have in authoritarian regimes. And I think that historically you see that through all kinds of technologies, right? I mean, even back during the Soviet period, you had book smuggling across borders and radio broadcasts, and in Iran you had cassette tapes, right? And I do think that social media provides an opportunity for these oppositions to innovate. I think one thing we see is that innovation is most effective in the beginning of a new technology, before governments have developed clear responses, right? So if you think about these as rational interactions between political actors, right, then when you come up with a novel strategy, the other player in the game, or in this case the state, right, doesn't have a ready-made response to that. And those are moments where I think we have a tendency to see shifts and potential changes in power dynamics. And I think that's part of what happened in cases like Gezi, in cases like Euromaidan, is that the state wasn't prepared for how to respond to this strategy, and it allowed for really innovative and new possibilities, for overcoming informational barriers and things like that. Now I think that states are better adapted, and it requires oppositions to innovate again. And what I think one of the risks is that now that the state has become more depending on which state we're talking about, more technically savvy or more adept at responding to these strategies, social media also provides an opportunity for state surveillance. There are some similarities and some differences, right? So I think that in both cases, it's clear that the state is attempting to find ways to limit the impact that new technologies, social media, in the Russian case especially, also blogs and other types of online digital communications, trying to limit the impact that can have and trying to limit the ability of oppositions to use those sources. What's been interesting is in the Russian case, one of the approaches to this has been to try to actually be partially in control of the companies that are of the social media companies themselves. So in Russia, the largest social media websites are not Facebook and Twitter. It's Vkontakte, which is a Russian origin company, which became partially controlled, but was originally a private company, just like Facebook or Twitter, and that shifted over time. We don't see that in the Turkish case. I don't think because Turkey wouldn't love to do that, but because Facebook and Twitter are the bigger platforms there, and those are international companies. What I think you do see that's similar is attempts to there's some attempts at censorship in both cases. You see that especially with blogs in Russia. But in Turkey, you see an attempt to actually censor certain accounts and also, of course, to shut down Twitter altogether in the country. And what I think has been really interesting in the Turkish case has been the creativity with which Turkish people have tried to circumvent those approaches by learning new technological tools to sort of get around the way that the state was trying to control that information. I think in some sense the Turkish case, because the Turkish approach, because Erdogan's approach was so, I'm thinking of the right word, it was quite severe quite quickly. I almost think that there was more backlash than in the Russian case, where sort of gradually over time there's been increased control, which I think sometimes is harder to oppose, harder to fight against than when there's a sudden shift in what's available, you know?